Once you've created a bone system, you can adjust some of the properties for your bone system through the Properties panel. There are two ways to do this. The first way is by selecting individual bones. Using the selection tool, I'll click on my bone system and then click on the first bone in my armature. In the Properties panel, you'll see settings for IK Bone. There are arrow buttons to enable me to navigate through my bone system. And then I have information like the name of each bone and the location of the bones, and then joint rotation and translation. Joint translation enables you to move the individual joints by themselves. So instead of just being connected at the bone system, they can sort of move independently. And for this example, we don't want to do that. What we want to do, though, is to set a constraint on the joint rotation. So I'll click Constrain for joint rotation, and the default constraint is plus or minus 45 degrees. And the default for this actually works pretty well, so I'm going to leave it as it is. Notice if I click and drag my bone system now, that if I go past the constraint, it works all right sometimes, but other times you see glitches like this. Just know that recording this title, I'm working in beta software, so there are some bugs. Hopefully on your release version of Flash CS5, you won't see the same problems. But even with these problems, know that the bone system works fine in the Flash player. This is just a bug for working in Flash and creating the bone systems. Early in this movie, I mentioned there were two ways to adjust bone properties. The other way is by selecting the frame span for your bone system in the timeline. So if I click on my frame span, you'll see that I have settings for an IK armature, different from an IK bone. Armature represents the bone system. So here I can adjust easing and the easing type, and then there's options for author time and runtime bone systems. We'll talk about that more in another movie. And then there's the style. This is the preview style for when you're working with a bone system. So if you look at the bones on the stage, if I change the style, I can preview them as wireframe or as lines. My personal preference is the default solid setting, so I'll leave it at that. So just remember that when you're working with a bone system, you can adjust bone properties through the Properties panel by selecting a bone or by selecting your frames in the timeline.